How do you make a choice? Do you reason it out, weigh every element, consider every path? Or do you trust your gut and let instinct decide? Trust yourself. Take a leap of faith. Or maybe you simply flip a coin. But how do you choose between life and death when you don't even know which is which? Sometimes, I wonder why my parents chose to settle on New Montana. It was never exactly a land of milk and honey. The terraforming was barely holding on, and civilization consisted of a few small towns and scattered farmsteads lost in an endless frontier. Maybe they believed it had potential, that one day, the ecology would stabilize, that towns would grow into cities, and cities would grow into something worth staying for. Maybe they were thinking about the future we would have there, my little brother and me. But even now, I still wonder, what were they running from when they left Earth? And more importantly, why did they choose to stay? The war had begun, and New Montana had become a frontline colony. Maybe the settlers truly believed in the cause. Maybe they simply had nowhere else to go. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder if they never really believed the war would reach us. It was my mother who woke me that night. I think I was already half awake. I remember hearing a low rumble in the distance, like thunder from a storm far beyond the horizon. Then I felt my mother's hand on my shoulder, shaking me urgently from sleep. "Leah, wake up. They're here." I was Leah Olsen. I was 13 years old, and I had spent my entire life on New Montana. Everything I knew was about to end. "What?" I mumbled, barely conscious. "Who's here? What's happening?" "The Curers. They've landed outside the shield. We have to go. Now." The name echoed in my mind for a moment. The Curers. The other kids and I had our own names for them: Curries, Roaches, Knifers, and a dozen others. Their real name was difficult for us to pronounce. But somehow, in that moment, with everything falling apart around us, my mother said it perfectly. And suddenly it felt like a bucket of ice water crashing over my head. They were here. The aliens. The enemy. They had come to destroy the colony. Since the war began 3 years earlier, we'd practiced evacuation drills at school. We'd done them so often that they felt almost routine, a normal part of childhood. If the attack had happened during school hours, I probably would have followed the drills without thinking. I would have lined up with the other children and walked calmly to the nearest bunker. But this wasn't school. This was home. It was the middle of the night. And outside, the distant sound of explosions was growing louder. "Leah, get up. We need to go." My mother's voice was urgent now, almost pleading. But I couldn't move. I sat frozen beneath my blankets, desperately willing it all to be another nightmare. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. Then another explosion struck. Much closer this time. The windows rattled violently. A second later, I heard my little brother crying in the next room. For some reason, that was the moment it became real. "I'm up. I'm up. I'll get Noah." I threw off my blankets as my mother rushed toward his room. What do I need? The question spun endlessly through my head. I was standing there in a t-shirt and shorts, and the first thing I thought was, I should get my bra. It was ridiculous. I barely even needed one back then. But panic does strange things to people. Your mind clings to small, familiar tasks because they're easier than facing the terrifying reality in front of you. I grabbed my hairbrush too. My long blonde hair tangled into knots every night, and brushing it was part of my morning routine. Another blast shook the house. This time, reality finally broke through. I had to leave. Now, I rushed into the hallway and nearly collided with my mother. She was carrying Noah, who had buried his face against her shoulder. I immediately noticed something. He didn't have his blanket. Noah was 4 years old, and he never went anywhere without it. For a split second, I wanted to run back and get it for him. But there was no time. No time at all. They were here. I slipped on my pink running shoes, and my mother grabbed my hand. Together, we ran out into the night. The first thing I felt was the cold. The night air bit sharply against my skin. The first thing I saw was the fire. The storage tanks at the edge of town were burning, sending towering flames into the darkness. Orange light flickered across the streets, casting long shadows over homes and terrified faces. A man sprinted past us at full speed. He moved so fast that he vanished before I could even think to ask the questions racing through my mind. Where were the enemy? How many were there? Which direction was safe? Then another question struck me. Where's Dad? With the militia. He had already left. Without saying goodbye. Sometimes I still imagine that moment. When the alert appeared on his phone. When he realized that the day he had spent 3 years praying would never come, had finally arrived. How did he react? Was he calm? Collected? Did he simply stand up and say, I have to get to the armory, take the kids to the shelter? Or did he freeze, just like I did? Sitting on the edge of the bed, breathing hard, trying to understand that the world he knew was ending. Did someone have to shake him, the way my mother had shaken me? Did someone have to remind him of his duty? Did he think he was going to die? Or did he convince himself it was just another false alarm? The second option feels more likely, because he never said goodbye. It would have taken only a second. My mother gripped my hand so tightly it hurt and pulled me through the maze of narrow alleys that wound between the houses. Everything on New Montana was built cheaply. Homes were packed close together, and many of the streets were little more than dirt tracks. It had rained earlier that evening. Before long, mud was splashed halfway up my bare legs. The darkness was almost complete. The enemy must have used an EMP. The entire power grid was down. Even the security lights above people's doorways had gone dark. The only illumination came from the fires burning somewhere ahead. They weren't as distant anymore. I could smell the smoke now. I could taste it. Every breath carried a sharp sting that scraped the back of my throat. Street after street, we hurried toward the shelter assigned to our district. New Montana wasn't a large town, only about 30,000 people. Yet what struck me most was how empty it felt. Our house stood near the outskirts, in one of the poorer neighborhoods. Most people had probably already reached the bunkers. Or maybe they hadn't. Maybe they had stayed behind, sitting silently in darkened homes, waiting for the enemy to find them. Then the rain began again. A cold drizzle at first. We turned a corner. And suddenly my mother yanked me backwards so hard that pain shot through my wrist. I almost complained. Almost told her she was hurting me. Then I heard it. Footsteps splashing through the mud. And the sharp, crackling hiss of an energy rifle firing somewhere nearby. The fires cast long shadows across the street beyond the alley. But these weren't human shadows. They were wrong. Too many arms. Too many legs. Shapes that seemed impossible. Monsters stretching across the wet pavement. Holding Noah close and silently praying he wouldn't make a sound, my mother backed away. We retreated the way we had come. Then we tried another route. And another. Searching desperately for a safe path to the shelter. The town had become a labyrinth of darkness. Blacked-out buildings. Rain-slick streets. Endless detours. Round and round we wandered until, despite having lived there my entire life, I no longer knew where we were. And judging by the look on my mother's face, neither did she. Every so often, another person would emerge from the darkness. A fleeting silhouette illuminated by firelight. Then they would disappear again, swallowed by the night. Once or twice, I heard voices. Militia members shouting orders somewhere in the distance. A few times, I heard screams. Real screams. The kind you never forget. But mostly there was only the rain. Wind-driven sheets of it rattling across rooftops. The distant crack of gunfire. The growing sense that the world was unraveling around us. Then we began passing bodies. Face down in the mud. Motionless. I tried not to look. And whenever Noah turned his head toward them, I stepped into his line of sight, shielding his eyes from what lay on the ground. Some things a 4-year-old should never have to see. I stepped into Noah's line of sight and forced a smile, pretending everything was fine. Don't be scared, I whispered softly. We're just going to the shelter, like we practiced in the drills. Don't look at the street. Just look at me, okay? Okay. I love you. Love you too. Those were the last words I heard him say. At every corner, we stopped. A quick glance around the edge. Then back into cover. Again and again, the route we needed was blocked. Dark silhouettes moved through the town, creatures that bore only the faintest resemblance to the images printed on recruitment posters and propaganda broadcasts. Those pictures had never captured the truth. Not even close. Then we reached one of the main roads. An actual paved street. And I knew immediately that we had to cross. There was no other way. The enemy was closing in behind us. Going back wasn't an option anymore. The sharp hiss of weapons fire cut through the rain. I froze. Energy bolts flashed across the mouth of the alley, lighting the darkness in bursts of blue-white light. My mother tried to pull me back again. This time, I pulled my hand free. Crouching at the edge of the building, I peeked around the corner. A barricade stood halfway down the street. 2 militia half-tracks had been dragged across the road to block whatever was advancing from the far side. A handful of militia fighters fired desperately from behind the makeshift cover. I don't think my father was among them. But I'll never know. I only looked for a second. Yet it was long enough. Long enough to see a man collapse. A glowing hole burned straight through his chest. The crackling energy bolts sliced through the rain, leaving trails of steam hanging in the air. A dead end. We couldn't move forward. We couldn't retreat. How do you make a choice like that? Run into gunfire? Or turn back and face the enemy closing in from behind? One path leads to death. One path leads to life. But there is no riddle to solve. No sign pointing the way. You simply choose, without knowing. I knew there were enemies behind us. I didn't know what waited on the other side of the street. I didn't know if I could cross without being caught in the crossfire. But at least there was a chance. I pointed across the road. My mother shook her head. We have to. I shouted. She didn't move. So I ran. I felt her fingers catch the hem of my shirt. For a brief moment, she almost had me. Then her grip slipped away. And suddenly I was exposed. Out in the open. An energy bolt flashed past so close I felt the heat of it against my face. The world exploded into light. Weapons firing. Rain falling. Shouts echoing through the darkness. I froze. For one terrible second, I nearly turned back. Then something inside me broke. Or maybe it hardened. I ran. I sprinted the final meters toward cover. An energy bolt grazed my shoulder just as I reached the opposite alley. Pain exploded through my arm. I stumbled. Spun sideways. Then crashed face first into the mud. But I had made it. I pushed myself up onto shaking elbows. Then scrambled into cover. I was soaked. Covered in mud. Covered in blood. But I was alive. I thought my mother would follow. If she saw that I had made it. If she saw it was possible. She would come. She had to come. She wouldn't leave me alone on the far side of the street. Not in the darkness. Not here. Across the flashing lines of energy fire, I could see her. Still crouched where I had left her. Holding Noah tightly against her chest. I waved frantically, begging her to run. But she didn't move. Panic began to rise inside me. I glanced toward the barricade. More bodies were falling. The defenders were losing. It was only a matter of time before the enemy broke through. I stood there waiting. Waiting for my mother to make her dash across the street. Waiting for her to choose. Then, slowly, horribly, I realized. She wasn't going to. I think I was crying. Or maybe it was just the rain running down my face. I had left my little brother behind. That was the thought that made me sick. Not the aliens. Not the battle. Not the fear. Noah. I should have grabbed him. I should have taken him and run. I should have carried him across myself. I wanted to go back. God, I wanted to. But I knew I couldn't. There was no time left. The enemy was already breaking through the barricade. I had one chance. One. For the last time, I beckoned for my mother to follow. Instead, she turned away. I think that was her way of giving me permission. She knew it was too late for her. Too late for Noah. But not for me. Not yet. For a moment, I stood frozen. Unable to believe what was happening. Unable to believe I was really going to do it. Then I left them. And ran alone into the night. There were fewer enemies on that side of the settlement, but I still nearly ran into them more than once. The shelters were no longer an option. Even if I reached one, the doors would have been sealed by then. So I headed for the scrapyard at the edge of town. The place where I used to play with the other kids. I knew every corner of it. Every pathway. Every hiding place. Even in the dark. It wasn't just piles of scrap metal. There were rusting harvesters, broken industrial machines, abandoned farm equipment, massive hulks waiting to be stripped for parts. Plenty of places to disappear. I expected it to be crawling with aliens. Instead, it was empty. The battle became distant flashes on the horizon. Thunder beyond the rain. Just another storm. One I could only hope would pass. I crawled inside the discharge pipe of an old harvester and pulled myself as far in as I could. There I sat a day, shivering, dripping wet, alone. And finally, I broke. I sobbed until my chest hurt. Because my mother wasn't there. Because my father wasn't there. Because deep down, I already knew I might never see either of them again. But most of all, because I had left Noah behind. My little brother. I could have grabbed him. I could have saved him. At some point, exhaustion finally won. I must have fallen asleep. Before I did, I pulled the hatch of the harvester closed as far as it would go. The cramped space trapped enough of my body heat to keep the cold away. And for the first time since the attack began, I drifted into an uneasy sleep. 2 blinked awake and immediately sneezed. Dry husks of wheat still clung to every corner of the old harvester. My shoulder throbbed where the energy bolt had grazed me, but the wound didn't seem too serious. Then I noticed something. Light. A thin beam of it slipped through the gap where the hatch refused to close completely. Dawn. For a moment, I reached for the hatch. Then reality caught up with me. If any of those aliens were nearby, opening it would be suicide. So I waited. A few minutes later, another problem became impossible to ignore. I desperately needed to pee. I briefly considered doing it outside the hatch, but the thought of making any sound, or leaving any sign that someone was hiding there, terrified me. Instead, I crawled deeper into the machine and relieved myself as quietly as I could. Then I waited. And waited. The hours crawled by. To keep myself sane, I sang my favorite songs in my head. Not aloud. Never aloud. Only silently. Other than that, I did nothing. I peed again. Tried not to think about the ache in my shoulder. And waited. When darkness finally returned, I listened carefully. Nothing. No voices. No gunfire. No footsteps. Only silence. I crept out of the harvester and drank rainwater that had collected inside an old hubcap. Then I returned to my hiding place and waited again. 4 days. That's how long I stayed there. 4 days before hunger became stronger than fear. By then, the sound of battle had vanished completely. I kept imagining I would return home and find everything mostly intact. A few scorch marks. A few broken windows. The militia standing victorious. My father among them. Heroes who had driven the aliens away. But even then, I knew it was only a dream. The fighting had stopped because the enemy had won. And if I stayed hidden much longer, I would starve to death. So I made my choice. I waited until nightfall. Then I left the scrapyard and began the long walk back toward town. A small part of me didn't even care if I was killed. The streets were still dark. The power remained out. Shadows swallowed everything. Moving carefully through the narrow alleys, I was nearly invisible unless someone was actively searching for me. At first, I headed toward home. Then I realized how foolish that was. Instead, I chose the nearest house. The door stood unlocked. The place was empty. Like everyone else, the family had left in a hurry. Mud-covered footprints crossed the floor. Someone had been there recently. I couldn't tell who. And I wasn't eager to find out. The silence told me enough. I hurried into the kitchen and began emptying cupboards into a plastic bag. Canned food. Crackers. Anything I could carry. Then I heard something. I froze. The sound wasn't inside the house. It was coming from somewhere out in the street. A low rumbling growl. Like heavy machinery idling in the darkness. My first instinct was to hide. My second was to run back to the scrapyard. Instead, I left the food behind and moved toward the sound. Because if something was making noise, then something was still alive. Most likely the aliens. I knew it was a terrible idea. But I couldn't stop myself. In my mind, I pictured a prison camp. Rows of frightened survivors trapped behind fences. My mother. My father. Noah. Waiting for someone to rescue them. I imagined finding wire cutters. Sneaking them out. Saving them. The fantasy felt real enough to chase. Then I heard voices. I dove behind cover, scrambling into an open garage. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might give me away. Only then did I realize how stupid I'd been. Everyone knew the aliens didn't take prisoners. I should have taken the food. Gone back to the scrapyard. Hidden. Survived. Instead, I was trapped. And if they found me, they would kill me on sight. Or worse. I curled beneath a workbench and prayed. prayed that whatever was outside would pass by. Instead, the voices grew closer and closer. I waited, barely daring to breathe. Then suddenly I realized something. The voices were speaking English. Slowly, cautiously, I crawled from my hiding place. Colonial Marines. It was over. I was safe. The attack had been nothing more than a raid. The Curers had left almost as quickly as they had arrived. They had dropped from orbit, struck the major population centers, and withdrawn before reinforcements could respond. They hadn't even stayed a full day. A single day. That was all they needed. Everyone was dead. Well, almost everyone. A handful of people, like me, had found somewhere to hide. Others had escaped the town entirely. A few had survived injuries that should have killed them, but not many. The aliens had a habit of finishing wounded enemies with knives. Some kind of ritual. Some survivors had only lived because they were pinned beneath the bodies of family and friends, hidden from sight. Out of a town of 30,000 people, only a few dozen remained. Perhaps 100. Maybe 2. I never learned the exact number. All I know is that it wasn't enough to fill the sports hall at my school. That's where they gathered us. Rows of military cots. Rows of broken people. The military had set up large screens displaying the names of the dead. Every body carried an identification chip. As they recovered remains, the names appeared. Families searched the lists for hope. For miracles. For loved ones who might still be alive. There weren't many miracles. The list grew longer every hour. My father's name appeared among a group of militia volunteers. He must have died in the trenches outside town. When I saw his name, I felt almost nothing. Because deep down, I'd already known. I kept searching. Shelter 6. Our neighborhood shelter. I recognized dozens of names. Neighbors. Friends. Children I'd played with in the streets. But not my mother. Not Noah. Then I found them. Further down the list. Their names side by side. Together. There was no explanation. No location. No details. Nothing to tell me what happened. I still don't know. Maybe they were caught in an explosion. Maybe they were shot trying to run. Maybe they were cornered somewhere dark and killed with knives. Even now, years later, I still wake in the middle of the night imagining it. A different nightmare every time. A different ending. A different death. Which one is true? I'll never know. And perhaps that's a mercy. At least I know they were together. I returned to my cot. And I cried. I cried until there was nothing left inside me. No one tried to comfort me. They were carrying their own grief. Their own ghosts. In the days that followed, more survivors arrived. More names appeared on the screens. Most of the shelters had become slaughterhouses. They had protected people from stray gunfire. But they had done almost nothing to keep the enemy out. The ones who survived were people like me. The ones who had hidden somewhere unexpected. After 3 days of sitting on a cot and surviving on military rations, a lieutenant gathered us together. His announcement was brief. We were leaving. New Montana was being abandoned. Just like that. The planners had finally accepted what anyone with common sense could have told them years earlier. A small frontier colony could not be defended forever. Not against an enemy like this. Less than 10% of the colony's population had survived. In some towns, survival rates were below 1%. There was nothing left to defend. Nothing left worth holding. We were told to return home one final time. And pack whatever we could carry. 1 bag only, they told us. Take only what you truly need. I sat on my cot for a long time after the announcement, waiting for someone to come and take me home. Eventually, it dawned on me. No one was coming. If I wanted to go home, I would have to do it myself. The streets still carried the scars of what had happened. Dark bloodstains marked the pavement. I passed a flatbed truck stacked with bodies, waiting to be taken to the mass graves being dug by mining excavators at the edge of town. At least the power was back on. That much had been repaired. When I stepped into the house, I immediately stripped off the same t-shirt and shorts I'd been wearing for nearly a week and turned on the shower. Everything looked so normal. Painfully normal. The furniture sat exactly where it always had. The dishes were still in the sink. The family photos still hung on the walls. For a moment, it felt as though my parents had simply gone out to run errands and would return at any second. Maybe Noah would come running through the door. Maybe everything would somehow be okay. But nobody was coming home. Not ever again. I stood beneath the hot water and let it run over me until my skin wrinkled, until the steam filled the room, until I couldn't think anymore. When I finally stepped out, I didn't even bother getting dressed. There didn't seem to be any point. I wandered through the house barefoot and dripping, my wet hair cold against my back, opening drawers, opening cupboards, trying to decide which pieces of my life deserved to survive. A school art project I'd made when I was 8. A framed family photo taken shortly after Noah was born. The real paper book my parents had given me when I graduated from primary school. How do you choose? How do you reduce an entire life to a single backpack? Then I realized something. The answer was simple. You don't. You leave it behind. That life was already gone. The aliens had killed it, just as surely as they had killed everything else. Eventually, I dried my hair and got dressed. 3 changes of clothes. 7 sets of underwear. Folded neatly and packed into the bottom of my bag. I grabbed a survival coat that compressed down to almost nothing. A few cereal bars. Just in case. There was no point taking a phone. The EMP had destroyed them all. Next came the important things. My birth certificate. My passport. The physical copies hidden away in my parents' closet. I took my mother's jewelry too. Not because I wanted it. Because someday I might need to sell it. A few practical things followed. Tampons. A knife. Odds and ends that suddenly seemed far more important than childhood keepsakes. Then, after putting it off for as long as I could, I walked into Noah's room. The silence hit me harder than anything else. I picked up his blanket. His precious blankie. The one he never went anywhere without. I could leave my old life behind. But I couldn't leave him behind completely. I needed something. Anything. To remember him by. I also removed the newest family photograph from its frame. The picture from my last birthday. The last photo we ever took together. When I arrived at the evacuation point, soldiers were already dismantling the shield generator. Piece by piece, they loaded it onto transport vehicles. They handled it with incredible care. Of course they did. The machine was worth more to the military than any of us ever had been. I'd like to say the shield was useless. But the truth is, without it, the aliens probably would have erased us from orbit before they ever landed. The last time I saw New Montana was from the window of a shuttle climbing towards space. Below us stretched endless forests and green farmland. Peaceful, beautiful, untouched. From that distance, you couldn't tell a massacre had taken place there. You couldn't see the graves. You couldn't see the blood. You couldn't see the ghosts. Then the shuttle banked sharply, and I saw the troop transport waiting in orbit. A massive, scarred vessel that would carry me toward whatever life came next. For months afterward, I don't think anyone called me Leah. Whenever someone needed my attention, they simply shouted, "Olsen." The nurses administering vaccinations. The cooks serving meals. The exhausted corporal responsible for keeping track of hundreds of displaced children. To them, I wasn't Leah anymore. I was Olsen. A name on a list. A problem to be managed. Another survivor among thousands. Eventually, a civilian liaison was assigned to me and 20 other orphans. The less said about the refugee camps, the better. Prospero. New Phoenix. Regulus. One temporary home after another. One endless line after another. One crowded tent after another. On Regulus, they shaved my head. There had been a lice outbreak. Apparently, even centuries in the future, humanity still hadn't invented a better solution than clippers. 6 months earlier, I would have cried for days watching my long blonde hair fall to the floor. By then, I had run out of tears. Was I a model refugee? A good girl who followed every rule and stayed out of trouble? Not exactly. The stereotype would have been easy enough. A grieving orphan falls in with the wrong crowd. Joins a gang. Starts making bad decisions. Gets into trouble. And in some ways, I suppose that's exactly what happened. Though history can decide for itself whether my choices were foolish or not. The military was everywhere around the camps. The worlds they sent us to weren't far from the front lines. There weren't enough ships to take us farther. And no one on the wealthy core worlds wanted millions of refugees arriving at their doorstep. The war had transformed entire planets into military staging grounds. Everything revolved around the conflict. The military moved us, fed us, housed us, managed us. And because the refugee camps shared logistics with nearby military bases, we stayed close to the soldiers. There wasn't much else for a kid to do. They tried organizing schools, but teachers came and went. Students disappeared as families were relocated. Records were constantly lost. And if you didn't feel like sitting in a tent listening to some exhausted old woman teach Shakespeare, nobody was going to chase you down. Guardians changed almost as frequently. Most barely knew my name. To them, I was paperwork. Another file. Another responsibility among thousands. The few who genuinely tried to help me, well, I didn't make their jobs easy. Looking back now, I wish I'd given them a little more grace. Their failures weren't entirely their fault. They were doing the best they could. The problem was that almost everything was being poured into the war effort. And what little remained for people like us was never enough. So instead, I started spending my time around the Marines. Why? Why does any teenage girl spend time around a group of young men who look invincible? Take a guess. By then, I'd been in the camps long enough that the exact age hardly matters. Pick a number that feels comfortable. Whatever age I was, they weren't much older. 18, 19, maybe 20. Kids, really. Though I didn't see them that way at the time. Back then they seemed fearless, strong, confident. Now, when I remember them, all I see are frightened young men hiding their fear behind jokes and bravado. Boys preparing to be sent to a front where casualty lists grew by the thousands every day. Those boys saved me. It would have been easy to join one of the gangs. The camps were full of them. Running scams. Extorting people. Trading stolen supplies. Every so often, somebody got stabbed. Military police would conduct a sweep. Tents would be searched. A few troublemakers hauled away. Things would quiet down for a week or two. Then everything would start again. I could have fit into that world. Easily. But the Marines were different. They believed in something. They were fighting for a cause. Protecting humanity. While the gangs fought over scraps and petty power. So I chose the barracks instead of the back alleys. At the time, I had no idea how important that decision would become. To me, those Marines were heroes. I would sit on a bunk for hours, listening wide-eyed as the one Marine who had actually seen combat exaggerated his stories beyond all recognition. And I loved every second of it. Of course, eventually an officer would show up. Or worse, a sergeant. Those drill sergeants were terrifying. They didn't care if you were a scared little refugee girl. Rules were rules. No civilians on base after dark. Period. More than once, I found myself being physically escorted off the base. A couple of bruises for good measure. One memorable evening, both my clothes and I were thrown out the front gate separately. I spent 10 minutes searching for my shorts in the dark while a group of military police laughed themselves sick watching me. I returned the favor with a very enthusiastic middle finger. It didn't stop any of us. And I say us because there was always a whole pack of refugee kids hanging around the barracks. The barracks weren't just full of soldiers. They were full of life. Girlfriends and boyfriends. Hustlers and dreamers. Kids who could find anything if you had enough credits. People running card games, trading favors, selling contraband, and finding ways to make a little money in a world that had forgotten them. I drifted between all those worlds. In truth, half the economy around those military bases was run by teenagers wearing combat boots and camouflage jackets 3 sizes too large for them. The gangs would have loved a piece of that business. But everyone knew the military bases were off limits. Get between a squad of Marines and whatever vice they happened to enjoy, and the best-case scenario was waking up in an alley with half your teeth missing. Slowly, life began to stabilize. The government finally accepted what everyone already knew. The people in the camps weren't going anywhere. Not until the war was over. So they started building something more permanent. Tents became huts. Huts became buildings. Families stopped being shuffled from planet to planet every few months.